Hi guys, I just wanted to make a quick update video to my original video, which was showing you how I cut out my segments for a segmented drum shell. A few people were having problems cutting the miter joints to get the segments to go together without any gaps, and I wanted to show you how I normally correct the angles using a disc sander. Because the bandsaw is great for cutting out curves, but it isn't particularly good for cutting the segments to length and doing the miter joints. So I normally still cut them using the bandsaw, but then I clean them up on a disc sander at the end. So I'm going to show you how I do that in a moment, but I just wanted to do a little recap showing you how I cut out the segments using the bandsaw. So first of all, we have this piece of MDF here with a series of holes in it, and that's clamped to the edge of the bandsaw table. Now I'm going to make a 14-inch ring with 10 segments per ring. So I need to cut the segments out so that they have a 14-inch diameter, or a 7-inch radius on the outside edge of the curve. So I'm going to use a hole on here which is 7 inches away from the blade. And I've set this thing up. This is the block of wood which I'm going to cut the segments from. This is a piece of Po Rosa, which is a nice exotic wood. It's a sort of rosewood substitute. It's a little bit easier to work with than rosewood. And we have this piece of oak here which has a series of holes drilled in it at 1/2-inch centres. Now firstly, these days I would normally cut the segments out a little bit thicker than 1/2 inch. But because I'm working with quite a small piece of wood here and I'm trying to get as many segments out of it as possible, I've decided to use the 1/2 inch jig. But that's going to mean there isn't a lot of extra wood to play with. Normally, if this is the first time you've tried this technique, I would recommend cutting the segments out at perhaps 3/4 inch centres, so you've got thicker segments to work with. That'll give you a bit more wood that you need to machine off when you turn the shell inside and out. So it'll make it easier to get the final shell size and thickness that you're going for. Anyway, I just want to do a quick recap showing you how I cut these things out. First, one thing I wanted to say is it's important that this block of wood is nice and square and parallel, and it's flat and the whole thing's the same thickness. If the edges are squint, or the board tapers from one side to the other, or the thickness varies, or if it was warped from one side to the other, that's going to make it much harder to get the next few steps correct, because we're going to be using offcuts from this block to cut the pieces to length, and also to sand them on the disc sander. Because once we've cut the curves, we aren't going to have straight edges to work from, so we need to actually use the offcuts to support the segments while we're cutting them to length and sanding them. Apologies, I do have a bit of a cold at the moment. So anyway, I'm going to cut this piece. Should produce 5 segments. So I need 2 blocks like this to make a ring with 10 segments in it. So we put the drill bit in here, and then it's put into a hole in here, which, as I said, is 7 inches away from the blade. much waste we've produced there from that block. It's very little waste. And we've got all these segments. So that's the whole point of this, is to reduce the amount of waste that you generate. But this piece here, we're actually going to use it. We're going to attach that to the miter fence when we're cutting out, when we're sanding the segments on the disc sander. We're going to use that piece. Okay, the next stage of cutting out these segments is to trim the segments to length. Now this part is actually quite tricky to set the thing up correctly. First of all, you need one of these jigs. I mean, this is basically just a piece of chipboard, and it has a runner on here which slides along the slot in the bandsaw, and that needs to be made quite accurately. This piece of wood here, on this one I can actually adjust the angle of this to suit different numbers of segments. It's currently set up for cutting a ring with 10 segments, but I've got other settings on here for doing 6, 8, 16 and 20, and I just unscrew these screws and then reposition the piece of wood to suit different angles. Now, the important thing about this is once you've cut the segments to a curve, you don't have a straight edge to work with, so you can't put the piece of wood against this board like that. It doesn't really work doing it that way either. So you actually need to use an offcut from the piece of wood that you cut the segments from. You need to attach on here, and I normally just use double-sided tape, and that allows you to, that gives you a straight edge to support the segment against there, because that'll hold the segment tight. It'll stop it rocking from side to side, and it'll allow you to support the segment while you cut the end on the bandsaw. But one thing that's important to remember is the segment, when this thing's set up correctly, the center line of the segments must align with the center line of the offcut. So I've drawn a line in the middle of there. I don't know if you can see it very well because the woods are very dark and there isn't very good lighting in here. But you need to have the two pieces lined up like that, so that the center line of the segment and the center line of the offcut are lined up. And as you can probably see, I've drawn a line on here and here showing where I want to cut this piece of wood. So when you stick this piece on here, you need to position it so that when the segment is aligned with the blade, so that you're cutting it at the line you've drawn, you need to have this piece of wood centered on the segment, and then you stick everything together. Okay, that looks about right there. Once you're happy with the alignment, and then press this thing on so it sticks tightly in place to that piece of wood. So I'll just zoom in a bit. Okay, so once you get this thing set up correctly, you should have that line aligned with the blade so that the blade just cuts on the outside of the line, and this piece of wood here needs to be centered on the segment. If that piece of wood, that offcut with the tape on it, was too far this way, that'll actually adjust the angle slightly, and if it's too far the other way, it'll adjust the angle slightly the other way. So you need to have it aligned. Now what I normally do is trim the offcut rather, so that it's shorter than the segment, because what I would then do is I would attach a block of wood over here like that, and that you can use that as a sort of depth stop, so that every segment can be held in the same place. Then I would put a clamp on here to hold that in place. Okay, that means that all the segments can then be positioned the same way. So I would normally trim one end of each segment, and then do every segment that you're going to do for the project, and then you can adjust this piece of this block, which is acting as a depth stop. You can adjust that and then trim the other end, and that will ensure you get all the pieces the same length. So I've just got 2 pieces of walnut here. These aren't actually going to be used in this project, but I just wanted to show you this process again, just giving you a little bit more information on how to set it up to get the thing to cut as accurately as possible. Bearing in mind that the bandsaw isn't actually the best tool to use for this job, because the blade tends to twist a little bit. I'd always recommend to keep the blade guide as low as possible, so it just clears the work and no more, and that'll help to prevent the blade from twisting, as long as you've set it all up correctly. And the other thing to do is change the blade. Don't use the same blade that you use to cut the curves to do this bit, because you don't want, you want this to cut as straight as possible, and a blade which has been used for cutting curves will wear unevenly, so it won't cut the straight cuts very well. So I would always change the blade when you change from curved cuts to straight cuts. So I'm just going to cut these 2 segments just to show you the process. I'll reposition the camera so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Right, once you've cut, obviously I'm just doing 2 segments at the moment to show you what I'm doing, but I'd normally have 50 segments for a project or something like that. But once you've cut one end of each piece, what you can then do is double check the length that you want the piece to be, and in fact I need to draw on the other side. Well, that one will do, because I've already marked it. So again, align the segment with the blade at the line that you've drawn, and then I've got this piece of wood cut with an angle on the end of it so that it meets the segment more accurately, and again clamp it back on here. Now that one end has already been cut, then you just slide the piece along until it hits that block, and that will ensure you cut all the pieces the same length. Now, because we're going to sand these pieces after we've cut them out on here, I would normally leave about an extra ½ millimeter on the length, so that I find ½ millimeter extra is enough to allow for sanding. So these pieces need to be 110 millimeters once they're sanded, so I would cut them to about 110.5 at the moment, and then I'll show you how to sand them just to get the angle just right in the next part of this series. So I'll just trim the other end now, and then I'll move on to the sanding part, which is probably the most important part, just to get the angle just right, because the bandsaw tends to leave a finish on the end of the wood which isn't really any use for gluing, and it also, the angle isn't usually perfect straight off the saw, to be honest. It's better to just to clean the ends up using the disc sander. So I'll just finish these 2 segments and then I'll move on.